Thank you all for being here. Try not to be too loud. Hi, everyone. My name is Emily McCoy, and I am the studio director and principal at Design Workshop here in Raleigh. And I'm also an associate professor of practice at NC State in the College of Design, and really enjoy seeing all your faces, many familiar in the crowd. I'm thrilled to also introduce you all to Rebecca Popowsky. Rebecca and I have actually known each other for, probably about 15 years or more. And Rebecca, I'm not sure if you remember this, but I'm also not sure how you could forget this. Rebecca and I first started our careers at a firm in Philadelphia in the early 2000s, and we met at a very bizarre holiday dinner. Do you remember that? At an Italian restaurant in the wine cellar that may or may not have been owned and operated by a crime family. But nonetheless, that was the first time I met Rebecca, and we shared a lot of laughs that night and have enjoyed just following your career development over the last 15 plus years. So I'm extremely pleased to introduce you to Rebecca. She's an incredible and talented designer and brilliant researcher, and look forward to an exciting and thought-provoking conversation this evening. Rebecca is a landscape architect and research associate at Olin, where she leads the firm's research and development group, Olin Labs. Her project and grant-funded research includes waste-based material design and innovation and practice-based research models. Since joining the Olin studio in 2009, Rebecca has continued to contribute to a wide range of design, planning, and construction projects. Her portfolio includes a lot of award-winning and really magnificent bodies of work, one being Canal Park in Washington, D.C., Dilward Park in Philadelphia, and a collaboration with the Army Corps of Engineers to restore the FEMA floodplain at the Potomac Park levee on the National Mall. No small projects. In addition to practice, Rebecca teaches core and advanced design studios and professional practice courses at the University of Pennsylvania. She also has a dual master's degree in architecture and landscape architecture from the University of Pennsylvania in Penn Design, and has a Bachelor of Arts in Architecture and Urban Studies from Yale. She is currently, this is very exciting, undertaking a PhD in practice-based research at Virginia Tech, and I hope that you'll get to introduce yourself and get to know Lou, who will be going from NC State to Virginia Tech this semester. So, without further ado, please help me in welcoming Rebecca to the stage.
Thank you so much, Emily. As you're talking, like flashes from that dinner are coming back to me. I can absolutely picture that Italian restaurant from the Schuylkill Expressway. So it's great to have Emily introduce me after a few years that we haven't seen each other, and it's really just great to be here, an honor to be here, and I have not ever presented anything in a venue with a disco ball, so this is phenomenal. I feel like I've made it. As Emily said, I'm the coordinator of research and development at Olin, which is a landscape architecture, planning, and urban design firm based in Philadelphia and Los Angeles. And what I'd like to talk to you all about, I hope is in the spirit of this event and of this lecture series and of this workshop here that the folks at situ have put together. And what it has to do with is the place of research in design practice. And it has to do with how we at Olin over the past 5 years have tried to use the frame of research as a type of vehicle to help us position our own practice in the spaces where we most want to be. So asking the types of questions that we think are most important to ask in the design field, and situating our practice among the communities of practice that we're most interested in working with. addressing the issues that we think are most urgent to our cities. I think before I kind of launch into some examples of the work that we're doing at Olin Labs, I want to comment on just the title of my talk here, Cultivating Communities of Practice in Design and Research. I'm going to pull out that phrase, communities of practice, because I think it's something that actually has become a really important frame in the work we do at labs and also the teaching that I do at Penn. So if you'll have a little bit of patience, the theory of community practice, which has been developed over the past few decades, is one that I think is really relevant to the types of conversations we're having here together today. And so this will sort of be kind of like a sub-theme for my talk. So Etienne Wenger is a theorist in social learning theory who has coined this term communities of practice in the late 90s. He says communities of practice are groups of people informally bound together by shared expertise and passion for a joint enterprise. A community of practice may or may not have an explicit agenda on a given week, and even if it does, it may not follow the agenda closely. Inevitably, however, people in communities of practice share their experiences and knowledge in free-flowing, creative ways that foster new approaches to problems. And I have a sense that I've kind of stumbled into a community of practice this week, and I appreciate kind of being included in this conversation. But there's obviously a community of practice here in North Carolina, in Raleigh, of folks in the design professions and adjacent professions that are concerned with the future of the built environment in this particular place. So I hope this talk can contribute to that. So as labs coordinator, I often run into this question, what is research, especially what is research in the context of practice? And when I teach research methods, I'm happy to dig into this question in very serious ways. But in my day-to-day practice, I'm really happy to just take the dumbest answer to this, which I read in a methods textbook, which is that every time you check the time, every time you look at your watch, you're doing research. You ask a question, you define your method, you answer the question. And if you are willing to just kind of say, okay, that's research, then I think you can start to ask more interesting questions in the context of practice, such as what can research do? And that really is the question that's been fundamental to us as we've launched Olin Labs over the past few years. What can research do? And especially, what can research do in practice or through design practice? More specifically, what can research do through our practice at Olin? So Olin, if you're not familiar, is as I said, a landscape architecture, urban design planning firm in Philadelphia and Los Angeles. And I like this image because it gives kind of a nice snapshot of where we mostly find ourselves in our core practice. This is what we do. We often find ourselves in big cities. This is Pier 26 in Manhattan, where we're negotiating incredibly complex and intense relationships between people and their environment. We're a firm of about 100 people, launched by Bob Hanna and Lori Olin in 1976, two Penn professors. So there's a long kind of history of teaching at Olin. And just for a context in terms of scale, we have about 100 people in the office, and Olin Labs, our sort of overhead, time and structure is about the equivalent of 3 full-time people. So 3% of our labor at Olin is invested back into research, more or less. This is the structure of labs. So we have 5 communities of practice: Tech Lab, Design Lab, Eco Lab, Build Lab, and People Lab. And the idea of structuring our research group as a community of practice is that we don't have separate researchers that are hired as researchers. We have landscape architects and planners who care about engaging in research. And anybody, all members of the office are encouraged to join one of these communities. So if you have a particular expertise, say in natural systems, you might want to join Ecolab. Or if you know nothing about natural systems and you want to learn, you might join Ecolab. But that's sort of how we run the R&D group. And the concentric circles indicate that the center ring is education. Some of our research efforts are about synthesizing knowledge that's coming in and teaching ourselves internally, so that's education. Some of it's about development, tools and methods. I was just talking to Emily in the back about Revit and Rhino, like workflow methods. That's a lot. And then the external ring, which is primary research. That's where I focus mostly. So pure research, primary research, or external collaborations. And so when I talk about how our research group ties into our core practice, I'm going to give just 3 case studies tonight, and I'm going to try to explain how these different case studies over the past few years have either supported or grown out of our core practices. And so the little diagrams, I'll get back to this, but the little diagrams on the side indicate the different relationships between our core practice and our research group. And as Emily mentioned, the doctoral work that I'm doing has a little bit to do with this, this framing of the place of research and practice. So getting into the first, the Nature and Wellbeing Project is kind of a multi-year initiative that Michael Miller, the guy in the middle with the bike, is a partner in our firm. And he's, from our end, he's been leading this, this relationship. But the Nature and Wellbeing Project is it's a much larger initiative that is led by a medical researcher and clinician, Dr. Gina South from University of Pennsylvania, and the Urban Health Lab at Penn. And Dr. South and her colleagues have built up over a decade longitudinal studies that do an incredible job of reflecting the impacts on health and well-being, physical health, mental, emotional, and also violence prevention of cleaning and greening vacant lots in Philadelphia. She's been doing this by observing a program that's led by the Pennsylvania Horticultural Society. It's been going on for about a decade, and PHS cleans and greens vacant lots in neighborhoods and then maintains them. And they've done over 12,000 vacant lots at this point. And their general strategy is they work with communities to identify lots, but their general strategy is clean up the lot. There's a lot of illegal dumping. Clean it up, regrade to make it flat, plant some lawn, a couple trees, and a post fence. And these, as you can see here, these lots are a lot nicer to look at, and they found that, just walking past these lots and seeing them on a day-to-day basis, as opposed to seeing a big pile of garbage, has major impacts on people's physical well-being. It slows your heart rate. It decreases depression. So over the years, they've built up an incredible body of research around this. Because Michael in our office had started to ask sort of informally questions through presentations and things, the question of can these lots do more? They're already doing so much, but can they become amenities? Can they start to invite people in? Right now, people just walk past. So when Dr. South moved from that observational research into another phase of research, she invited Olin in to become part of the research team. What she's interested in doing, and this is over the past couple of years, is moving from a research process of observing people, experiencing this, into actually intervening through design into these lots to see what else can be done. How can you actually try to draw people into them, into the lots, and get people actively using and feeling ownership of these places. And so we were able to, with 3 pilot sites in 3 different neighborhoods in Philadelphia, to work with Dr. South and her team and some incredible community organizers and community leaders to design 3 lots and to implement and to build these lots. And actually what I want to kind of focus on today is not how wonderful this is, but how messy and challenged this whole process was. And I'll just note, this does not look like much at all. And I just want to note that this kind of design intervention, working with this research team, was as much work as the Pier 26 project that I showed you, not literally in billable hours, but in terms of complexity, in terms of pulling your hair out, in terms of real thinking and design, they're some of the same people on this project that were on that other project. And it's a different kind of design intelligence that is embedded in this process, and a lot of it has to do with failure in terms of when community conversations tell you that your idea is not what's needed, it's not the right thing right now, then the process of hearing that and recalibrating was something that was more intense maybe in this research initiative than anything I'd ever seen on project work. And it was amazing to work with medical professionals in that process, the way that medical professionals and medical researchers led conversations with community. It was incredibly educational for us. But when I say failure, what I'm talking about is that messiness. Ultimately, I think that these did end up being, this really was a successful initiative in that it set Dr. South and her team up as sort of a pilot attempt. It set her and her team up to get investment into a much longer term, multi-year, multi-million-dollar project that she's kicking off now called Deeply Rooted. And so I think what I want to kind of pause here and highlight, what Dr. South does as a medical researcher really challenges this question of what is research. So yeah, what is she doing? This is applied research. Okay, right, we know. It's applied research. But what she's actually doing is a type of practice that goes far beyond research. She's going from her medical expertise, she's doing community organizing, she's doing kind of systems convening. She's built a network of a community of practice and a network of communities now throughout the city that have invested deeply into this effort. And that's where the power of this initiative is coming from. And that's where I think we have a lot to learn as designers from people like Dr. South in terms of how she's using the frame of research as an entry point into the places where she, and then she's practicing in some of the ways I think we as designers like to think that we practice to implement that change. And so I'm going to pause for like a really long interjection here of community of practice reading. I'm just going to read this to you because I'm going back now to this community of practice theory. This is a quote from Etienne Wenger again, the one I started off with, to kind of touch back on how I see community of practice now kind of manifesting through Dr. South's work. So it says, I have argued that the structure of practice is emergent, both highly perturbable and highly resilient, always reconstituting itself in the face of new events. In a world that is not predictable, improvisation and innovation are more than desirable, they are essential. The relation of design to practice, and I'll just say, when Wenger is talking about design, he doesn't mean design of buildings, he's actually a learning theorist. So he's talking about design of pedagogical design, but it's very relevant to how we think of it too. The relation of design to practice is therefore always indirect. It takes place through the ongoing definition of an enterprise by the community pursuing it. In other words, practice cannot be the result of design, but instead constitutes a response to design. A piece of software, for instance, is the result of design. It does not execute as expected. If it does not execute as expected, then there's a bug. This bug indicates a faulty design stemming from an incomplete or inaccurate specification or from a lack of detailed analysis. By contrast, practice is a response to design. Unexpected adaptations to the design are inherent in the process. They do not necessarily indicate a lack of specification. In fact, they may very well indicate a healthy response, which allows a design to be realized meaningfully in specific, but always underspecified situations. As a consequence, the challenge of design is not a matter of getting rid of the emergent, but rather of including it and making it an opportunity. So to me, this really resonates in the context of that last case study, this idea of always underspecified, the idea of entering into a situation with enough structure, but yet enough flexibility to truly respond to the emergent context that you see. The projects that we ended up building with Dr. South were so pared down, partly because of budget, but partly because that was what the community wanted at that particular moment. There was a lot of fear. There's a lot of gun violence in these neighborhoods. The idea of putting a bench or shade was the opposite of what a lot of people wanted at that time. And so what we ended up actually providing the communities in some cases was the most restrained kind of design, and then a set of potential future steps that they could take. So handing over a package to say, what you really need is to fix the sidewalks, and you need street trees at this bus stop. We can't do that. We don't have, for regulatory reasons, we can't do it. And so here are the people you would contact to push for that through your council member. And so the design that we handed off to the communities had a lot more to do with that kind of systemic intervention that could play out over the course of many years, and that could really be in the hands that, the attempt, of course, overused word, but the attempt to empower those who were actually, living and staying in these places. So as a research model, this is where labs kind of sits in this particular case between a longer-term, larger research initiative outside of our discipline. On one hand, there's an effort from labs to absorb, as we're learning from researchers like Dr. South, to bring that knowledge into our core practice. Because we're part of a community of practice with Dr. South, we're also occasionally giving input back to her team. And then when possible, labs is allowing the practice to support their research directly. The next case study is called Circular Soils, and this is one that I've been focused on now for 4 or 5 years. And this is what we call project near research, where we're pulling project questions out of the work that we do in core practice. This was a question that partner Richard Rourke came to labs and said, I'm really tired of mining all of this natural material for soils, mixing it up, and then putting it into cities. This is supposed to be a green endeavor, and yet we know that we're borrowing a lot of non-renewable materials to do our green infrastructure. And so what he said is, can't we use glass instead of sand for our GSI? There's a lot of sand, natural sand, used in green infrastructure. And so when we said, I don't know, let's see. What we found is that just looking at the city of Philadelphia, we estimated about 70,000 tons of sand is purchased by the city annually just for public green infrastructure investments. That's a lot of sand, and in a lot of places in the country, sand is running out. We also found that Philly doesn't recycle glass, and neither do most cities in this country. They collect glass and then they landfill it. And so that was already kind of appalling, but literally all the glass is going to the landfill. And that's about 90,000 tons, we estimated. So it's weirdly kind of a similar amount. And we also know that a lot of food waste is going into landfills. And so the question we asked was, can we use glass as a replacement for sand? And can we also use food waste to produce a locally sourced, high-performing soil? And what we were hoping to contribute through this research was really open source kind of systems planning. So is it safe? Proof of concept. Is it safe? Does it work? And did the economics pan out and logistics? Can anybody actually make this kind of thing happen in a city like Philadelphia, which already has a lot to deal with? And the idea would be to make this information then available to municipalities, recyclers, and industry people. So when we started out in 2019, the proof of concept, we started with the lit review, and we were sort of surprised to find that this hadn't really been documented. So glass, sand, just crushing recycled glass down to like a sand particle size is well proven in a lot of civil engineering for like pipe under drains, things like that, or pipe embedment and under drains. But it hadn't been proven as a planting medium. And so we identified that as a gap in the literature. We did an LCA with some folks at Penn, a life cycle assessment, and found that recycling actually does provide a benefit. We weren't sure whether crushing glass up would actually be less impactful in terms of greenhouse gases than mining sand, but according to the LCA, it would be benefit. And we also did a quick 12-week greenhouse trial at Penn again, which is shown above, which showed that GSI plants grew as well in the glass-based soil compared to the control soil. So with that kind of proof of concept in hand, we were able to get funding from William Penn and work with Temple University on some laboratory studies, which are down here at the bottom. It's called a mesocosm or a column study that looked really at water quality. So Those columns are like soil profiles that we would typically have in a GSI tree pit, with the topsoil at the top and then the drainage layers beneath. And each of the columns have different ratios of glass sand and regular sand mixed in. So we wanted to see, how does that impact the hydraulic performance? How does it impact the water quality of the leachate that's coming through? And, is there an issue with like microplastics? And I guess maybe I'll go back. What we found is that there are some real differences between the materials and how they perform. Water moves more slowly through glass. We think it's hydrophilic. And the glass is a higher pH as well. And so there were enough questions that came out of that study that really further study is needed. But with that, we were able to get funding from the EPA to do another greenhouse trial and also to start a more serious economic analysis of how this would actually work in the city of Philadelphia. So our greenhouse trial, once again, with new mixes, showed no statistical significant ground or below ground growth between the various mixes. And it looked like there are economically feasible ways of making this happen in a city that doesn't have money to spend. And the biggest thing is, throwing glass in the landfill is actually really expensive because it's really heavy. And so the worst thing you can do is what we're doing, which is to have people separate the glass out, like clean their peanut butter jars, put it in the blue bin, and then have the city come collect it, deliver it to the recycling, the MRF, and then have them landfill it. That's like so many bad decisions. And so, that's where the savings ends up coming from, is if you can divert that cost. And so with a phase 2 EPA grant, we were able to try to do a pilot study here, which we're actually we're in the process of now. And so we worked with Parks and Rec and the Philadelphia Water Department to identify a site, which is in that orange fence down there, which is along the Schuylkill River on Kelly Drive, along Boathouse Row, if you know Philadelphia. And we installed a trial plot back in October, which looks at half of the rain garden is glass-based and half of it is a control soil. So we're working with some engineers at ENLP Engineering to monitor water quality and water flow on that site, as well as plant growth over a year. So we'll get a lot more of a sense of this over that longer span than we ever did in the greenhouse trials. And then what's really cool about this is that the EPA also wants to see this sort of thing come to market. And so their grant is supporting what we're calling a manufacturing hub. On the top there, we're partnering with Bottle Underground, which is a small women-owned nonprofit in Philly. They're actually glass artists, but they've recently expanded their art shop in South Philly to try to build out like something at a larger scale that can really divert volumes of glass in a more serious way. And so this research project supports the expansion of their facility there in the top right, and the purchase of some new glass pulverizing equipment so that they can actually start. A lot of people want to drop their glass off, like people, but also like big businesses like Yards and the Eagles, like want to drop glass somewhere, and there's nowhere to go. And so there's a real demand for, and Bottle Underground is like, we can't take it. We're like scraping labels off by hand. And so this is like an effort to help them scale up and to start to be able to accept these bigger sources of waste. So this is what it looks like when they, and for our pilot plot, we sourced all of this glass locally through Bottle Underground. This is what it looks like to mix GSI soil. This is this is the soil blender that the city typically uses for GSI. So they were able to mix it up just the way they normally do. And then on the other side, that pile of dirt in the foreground is the glass-based medium, and the background is the control. So it's being installed. And this is yesterday. I was just out there measuring plants. So it looks like a jungle. It's really hard to measure plants that are that dense. But if you can see at all, there's like a little yellow string that runs diagonally across. That's the string that divides the glass from the control. So maybe we can have a little test later to see who can guess which side is the glass. But anyway, the plants seem happy. And this is me and my colleagues out yesterday measuring and photographing plants in the field. And then this is Bottle Underground's facility with the new glass pulverizer, looking very dusty. And we're now working with Bottle Underground to try to work with the city to come up with a leasing agreement for a vacant lot there on the right, because they really now need to expand. They're in a basement. They need to get bigger. They need to have space. They need to have a public face, right? They need to be able to be in the neighborhood and say, look, guys, this is where your glass is going, and also to do some outreach and job training. So we're working on setting up a more public-facing outdoor facility with them. We'd like to. So these are the folks that we're working with. And I think what is cool about this initiative, one of the things is that it's very scalable, and this idea can definitely work at a very large city scale like Philly, or in a very small rural community. This equipment is very cheap, and you can get one to fit in your kitchen, like a glass pulverizer. You can get one that will take care of all of New York City's glass. And so this is just an example of from this initial study. We're in conversation with a few different interested parties in expanding this study. So this is the University of Maryland, potentially interested in combining and looking at glass sand and mixing that with dredge material in Baltimore Harbor for shoreline restoration. And so in terms of a research and practice model, this is one where we pulled this research question out of our core practice. There wasn't enough time or budget to answer this question within the context of a normal, project analysis or research phase. And so labs took this question on as a longer-term initiative outside of project work. And then as we learn more, we're able to feed that knowledge back into our core practice along the way. So that's what I would call project neuro-research. And then the third and final case study I want to talk about is called Tidal Philly Resiliency. This is a third model, and I think that, honestly, this is maybe the one that's most relevant, at least to how I kind of see the space we're in right now. So I don't know if you all would have seen in the news in 2019 when a large part of South Philly exploded. There was a big explosion in the oil refinery in South Philadelphia on a site that was approximately the size of Center City, Philadelphia. And miraculously, nobody was hurt, but the entire site is now decommissioned, has been sold to developers. And there's just a huge question mark about what the future of this corner of the city is going to be. And so at that time, soon after that, some of the local organizations, the Clean Air Council is an advocacy group, William Penn Foundation, Lindy Institute, and Drexel, they gathered a community kind of conversation around this topic. And Olin was invited to contribute to that discussion. It was just like a few days of a workshop, just like what are we going to do? All the local universities and practitioners, and also community groups. And so it was a very quick kind of statement from this group. They put out this document, but it had to be fairly high level because it was such a quick thing. And they asked Olin to provide this kind of visionary graphics, but we were very aware at that time that we don't know if this could work. It was sort of a statement of we want the waterfront to belong to the city. We want this to be a public amenity. It's completely cut off as it is. But how that actually happens, we have no idea because we have no information about what's really here, right? And so, there was always this question of how can we continue to be part of this conversation? And part of it was a decision on behalf of the office, the leadership of the office, to not actually join a consulting team for this, or not to actually go after this project on behalf of the owners, but to figure out how can we stay part of this conversation from the standpoint of the neighborhoods, of the community groups that we want to support. So we kind of found an opportunity to do that when the Landscape Architecture Foundation, I don't know if any of you would have been aware of this effort, but in 2020, the Landscape Architecture Foundation put out a call for a nationwide Green New Deal super studio, where they invited, and NC State, I think, took part in this. They invited design studios, academics, and practitioners to take part in a year-long nationwide studio to respond to the tenets of the Green New Deal, to put forward a vision of what landscape architects saw as a potential of the Green New Deal. So the tenets are jobs, justice, and decarbonization. And so at Olin, we decided to go full force into this. Most of the groups that took part in this super studio were universities, but we were really interested in this question of like, what would a practice bring to this super studio that's different than what the university studios are able to bring? And so we decided to dedicate an entire year of our research resources in 2021 and made it the year of the Green New Deal. And we asked all the staff in our office to pitch ideas for studios. Like if you're going to run a studio internally in the office and staff it over a year, what would the topic be? What would you take on? And so Michael Miller and Cindy Sanders kind of organized, and Marnie Burns organized a group around the refinery site. And they worked over 6 months with 7 or 8 staff to really dig into the research into this site, into the potential for this site and the problems, the challenges. So this is not primary research. They're not going out onto the site. We wouldn't possibly be able to do that. They're not like taking soil samples or anything like that. This is an analytical process based on information that's publicly available. And they very specifically didn't want to put forward a design proposal as part of this super studio. They wanted to present an analysis that would basically tell the city, this is what we think needs to be taken into account. This is what we think is at stake on this site. And the city has to be able to look holistically at this place before kind of handing it off. And so they looked, of course, at remediation. They looked at air quality, water quality. I mean, as you can imagine, it's pretty disturbing for those of us that live within pretty close distance, live and work within a pretty close distance of this site. And they looked at things like, what would it really take to remediate this place, to make it safe for us to actually go in, for somebody to go in there and say, yes, the public can enter this site? Are we talking about 5 years, 50 years, 100 years? And then they also wanted to look at the memory of the site, because there's a lot of trauma and a lot of damage in the adjacent communities in South Philadelphia that have been harmed over the years by this fossil fuel processing infrastructure. And so they wanted to look at the memorial potential as well. And then they took it to a nationwide scale, and they said, if we're serious about the Green New Deal and we're really going to be shifting this industry towards renewables, there are going to be a whole lot of sites that are going to be transitioning from fossil fuel infrastructure across the country. And so this is not a problem of South Philadelphia, it's a problem around the country. And where is this transition going to be the most, felt the most strongly? And what's cool is that I think partly because of that research initiative that was really an internal kind of analysis process, soon after the end of it, Olin was invited by the Clean Air Council, which is an advocacy group, and the William Penn Foundation to actually take part in a grant-funded true planning project, which began in March of this year, which is actually expanding from that little piece up there is Philadelphia, expanding south along the tidal Schuylkill and tidal Delaware, along communities that have been that are industrial waterfront sites and that are likely to be impacted by climate change and sea level rise. And so I think what's most exciting to me about this particular example is how the research that was supported by Olin Labs was used in a way to position Olin within a community of practice and to situate our practice in a way that is not easy to do through typical business development or project work. This is the kind of work that doesn't come through like the RFP pipeline. It doesn't come out. I guess what I really mean is this isn't the sort of thing that somebody comes and asks you to do if you're a landscape architecture firm. But as a private practice, being able to put a stance out and also to be able to convene a conversation among local groups around this issue, that process enabled us to kind of be in the room. I'll just put it that way. And so this is the kind of work that Labs does that I think is most about cultivating communities of practice, situating practice within these larger communities. And then finally, I'm going to just touch on my teaching practice. And, I've taught now at Penn for 8 or 9 years, and I've always felt a little bit, I think probably a lot of those of us that teach and also practice design feel like a little bit like, oh my God, I'm living two lives. Like, how are these things actually feeding into each other? And so a few years ago, I really asked, how are these ideas of communities of practice and practice-based research feeding into the university? And how is this actually one conversation rather than two? And so with my colleague, Sarai Williams, we designed this course at Penn, which is called Unruly Practices. And it's a seminar that is meant to expose students to alternative modes of professional practice and to help students start to already build their own practices while still in grad school, their own creative and design practices, and to try to grapple with the types of skills that will put them in a position to be unruly when they leave the university. I think most of the practices that we tend to present to students when we have guest lectures and things are fairly, within the bounds of conventional design practice. They're often very curated pictures of what design practice can be. And I think that's actually not what the students are hungry for. And so this course is designed in two parallel tracks. One is about skill building, what are the skills that you will need in order to be unruly? What do we think are the most useful skills? So that's things like basic research methods. It also is project management. It's journalistic and interviewing methods. It's a little bit of business planning. And then I think what's really fun is the other parallel track is that every week we bring in 2 or 3 unruly practitioners, architects, landscape architects, planners, artists. We had a filmmaker. And the students interview them via Zoom as a class discussion. The students moderate discussions with these practitioners. And it's really pretty inspiring. It's we don't ask them to come and have something worked out to present to the students, which I feel like often creates a little bit of a distance. But we just say, just show up. And then the students lead the conversations in the way that they think are going to be most useful. And it gets really raw. It gets really hysterical sometimes. But there's a lot of tough questions that the students really want to know the answer to, like how did you start a design practice and still pay your student loans, things like that. So I'm just going to finish here with another really long quote that I'll read you, but I feel like coming back to communities of practice and reflecting a little bit on my experience, both in teaching and practice, and what I see happening here this week, which I think is really powerful as a kind of learning and community building space that in situ has supported here. Learning cannot be designed. Ultimately, it belongs to the realm of experience and practice. It follows the negotiation of meaning. It moves on its own terms. It slips through the cracks. It creates its own cracks. Learning happens, design or no design. And yet there are few more urgent tasks than to design social infrastructure that fosters learning. This is true not only for schools and universities, but also for all sorts of organizations in the public and private sectors, and even of entities usually not called organizations like states and nations. In fact, the whole human world is itself fast becoming one large organization, which is the object of design and which must support the learning we need in order to ensure there is to be a tomorrow. Those who can understand the informal yet structured, experiential yet social character of learning and can translate their insight into designs in the service of learning will be the architects of our tomorrow. So with that in mind, it's really exciting to be here with people who seem to be doing a great job of designing structured, experiential, social, and informal spaces for us all to think and learn. So thanks.
Rebecca, thank you so much for coming to Raleigh and sharing your amazing work with us. Everyone, let's give her one more round of applause. And if you're up for it, we have time for some questions. Just raise your hand and I'll bring the mic to you.
Hi, Rebecca. Thanks for your talk. It was really impactful. I had a question about relationships. You talked about it a little bit with the connection of Olin and the universities, but if you could elaborate a little bit on how you foster, develop, start the relationships with the city, with the neighborhoods. It just seems, I love that you are able to touch all those different communities, but it seems like the relationships are such a big, important piece of that. If you could just elaborate a little bit on how you get that started and continue it.
That's a great question. And actually, I think that question is, over these few years, something that I think has been emergent about how labs works is that it tends to be local. So everything I just showed you is Philly specific. And that's not necessarily an intentional decision, but it has emerged as the character of what we've been doing. You know, some of it is, of course, because we really care about the city we're in, but some of it is those relationships. And so it's spaces like this that have kind of seeded that those opportunities. Sometimes it's because a lot of us teach, a lot of us in practice do teach, and so we do already have relationships with universities. But I would say maybe the more significant things have been, for example, I talked about Michael Miller a couple times, who's a partner at Olin. He's just he's very involved in his neighborhood. You know, he's in, he volunteers in his, neighborhood CBO. And so it's that kind of just, you have to rely on real, authentic, connections to the place you are. And I guess one thing I'll just add to that is, it's one thing to know a lot of people in your town, but it's another thing to be able to go to those people with something that feels like germane for a real collaboration. And that's one of the hardest parts of my job, I would say, is identifying those opportunities. And so, for example, in the Soils Project, we went for very concrete reasons to talk to people at Parks and Rec, Philadelphia Parks and Rec, with specific questions. But in the course of months of conversations with those folks, Daniel Lawson at Parks and Rec was like, you know what I wish we could get a grant for? Like biochar. And it was like, really? What are you going to do? What are you talking about, right? So then it sort of steers us like, oh, this is what they're actually looking for. And that's the kind of conversation that just comes after these kind of longer relationships. I can't think of any examples where we've said, we're going to build a relationship from scratch in order to take on this research project. Does that answer it all?
Yeah, that's helpful. Thank you.
That was great. Thank you. Quick technical question. Can you use that sand for concrete? And then longer question, in my practice, my expectation is that I hit my billable hours. What is the expectation of Olin has to its labs group?
Yeah. So there's expectation and then there's desire. So the concrete question is that there's a lot of research going into, especially more in the engineering and architecture space, looking into concrete, and it's not an easy answer. There's problems with it, but there are problems that folks are working out. So I think my guess is that there are going to be some applications of concrete where it'll be feasible and others where it won't be, just because of the strength. So probably in our work, like in footings, I'm guessing it could be feasible. We haven't gone there yet, though. And then, then the budget stuff. So like the slide I mentioned at the beginning where I said we have 100 people and we have the equivalent of 3 full-time employees that are budgeted for labs. And as I mentioned, like those are not 3 real people. Those are hours that are dispersed among all the folks in the office who want to work on research. And so it's the equivalent of about 6,000 hours. And so that's an overhead investment that the office is willing to make at the beginning of the year, or to set at the beginning of the year. We don't typically use all that overhead. Enough grant funding to bring that to 0. That would be the goal. We've never done it. But so it's really kind of a delta there where the office decides at the beginning of the year how much are we willing to put into this purely from overhead, and that's just like a percentage. So the challenge with smaller practices is that if it's in our case 3% of labor, then if you have 10 people, what does that look like? And one of the things that I think there is a threshold in terms of, this is just me making stuff up, but in terms of how effective this sort of work can be, I think it makes a big difference that I'm able to focus on this, because if you have somebody who's like a quarter time or half time on this sort of thing, but also doing project work, then the pull is just too hard from project deadlines. It just gets eaten away. That's what I've seen in a lot of cases.
Thanks.
Any other questions? I know there's one in the front.
Hi, I was just wondering if your team at Olin Labs paid any particular attention to the types of plants that were growing from the soil project. Specifically, if you noticed if invasive species were more likely to grow from the soil. I noticed typically that those are more hardy plants and they're capable of spreading to a larger environment. I'm not a Philly native. I don't know anything about the plants there, but if that's something that you noticed, how have you been mitigating the spread of any invasive species, or if you've noticed that there's not necessarily a significant uptick?
Yeah, that's a great question. That's something we actually asked ourselves, should we measure that? Mm-hmm. Because we did think there might be a difference. And we have not, because we selected the plants to be the ones that are most typical of the Philly Public Works GSI, so that the data that we're getting is immediately applicable to the public works, to the water department. And so what that means is we're going out there and pulling the invasives. And it's actually it's kind of fun. I mean, that's a really great side thing, is that sorry, we're gonna have to, instead of going sit at our desks, we're gonna have to take our kids out and pull weeds. So we don't know, but it would be a great thing to look into in a future study.
Hi. I'm Erin. I was really intrigued with the glass being incorporated in the soil, but you pulled up the slide where they were breaking down the glass, and I noticed the dust like you had mentioned, so I was just wondering how you maintain work environments for the people that are crushing it down, because I know that glass particles in your lungs can be really harmful.
Sorry, glass what?
Glass particles getting your lungs, how insulation getting your lungs is pretty bad. I would assume it's probably a hazard, right?
So actually, there is a lot of research into that, and it's, believe it or not, it's safer than sand because it doesn't cause silicosis. I think that's what it's called. And it has to do with, glass is made out of sand, but it has to do with how it's heated and then crystallizes, that it doesn't cause that kind of the impacts that breathing sand causes. And so in the case of, the Bottle Underground, they are wearing masks, and they, are keeping that area, separate from other working spaces. But there's actually a lot of use of glass as a, what do you call it? When you spray to make something smooth. Sandblast, thank you. As a sandblasting medium, because it's safer, actually. So it's surprising, but that's what that's kind of the research that we've seen on that. It's used pretty commonly as a sandblasting and like a filtration media. So that's one of the types of safety questions that we didn't have to answer ourselves, but we were able to find, in the literature.
Hi. I had a question. So you were talking a lot about how like the sand and showing like the difference between how much of the glass in Philly actually gets like thrown to waste. And I was a little bit curious of, has there been any like talks or like working to see like how can we actually get that glass to be recycled from like everyday people? Would that be like an alternate place to put your glass, or would that like be something that you'd work with the recycling facilities? Have you like thought or had talks about that?
Yeah, that's a lot of what we're doing with our kind of feasibility planning, and we've been testing out two basic models. One is if Philly as a city were to decide to do something about the glass problem, how much would it cost them in their current single stream recycling system to install the right equipment in their, waste management is the big corporate behemoth that deals with our city's recycling. And so the initial economic feasibility study we did went with that model, and it looked feasible from the standpoint of economics. It would be beneficial to install that machinery based on the savings of the landfill. Honestly, part of the problem, though, is that Waste Management owns the recycling facility, but they also own the landfill. And so when they pay to landfill, they're paying themselves. So there's not a great incentive structure for that. It would have to come from the city insisting. And so because that's a big lift, because recycling, contracts come around every 5 years or so, right now we're focusing more on that individual choice. And so that's where individual and company choice. And so that's where Bottle Underground, we're working with Bottle Underground to develop a commercialization plan for them to have enough space that they can start to go to businesses and say, wouldn't you rather see your glass being recycled? And that's a voluntary, right now it's a voluntary drop-off. And right now in their current location, they have to like pick random, really like inconvenient hours because they have so many people that want to drop off their glass. There are a lot of nice people in Philly. They have so many people that want to drop off their glass and they don't have space. So they only let people drop off their glass from like 3 to 4:30 on Wednesday and like 8 a.m. on Tuesday to kind of limit the intake. So the thought is that if they could scale up, they'd be able to take on a lot more. And like I said, there are some big businesses that have a lot of glass waste that are also interested in that as a voluntary choice.
Good evening. I'm in the back.
Oh, okay.
My superhero name is Mama Kai, and I want to thank you for this presentation. I was particularly impressed and moved by the first research project that you talked about, the Deeply Rooted. I am looking to eliminate homelessness both internally and externally here in Raleigh, and I have a concept called Homesteads for the Homeless, and getting people back out into nature, private and community gardens. And so I had never seen, and I had honestly never thought to look for a research project that correlated green spaces with minimizing violence. And so I'm really curious as to what the effects have been, especially because I found it particularly interesting that the communities felt like it was something that they didn't need. Mm-hmm. And so if you could kind of walk a little bit through that, take a minute to walk us through like how it came from we don't need this to like we accept this, and then what has been the benefits that the communities have seen.
Sure. And I'm really happy to share more background on that whole body of research because it's been a decade and it's really deep. So to answer your question about that kind of, the impacts initially. So what Dr. South and Charles Brunat have shown is that violent crime around vacant lots diminishes comparing pre-cleaning and greening to post-cleaning and greening. And, I don't want to misspeak, but I think part of it is just that, feeling like a place is cared for, right? But part of it is also literally like just not having places to hide stuff, so like not having piles of stuff that where you can't see anything. And so they've shown like lower rates of gun violence and violent crime in those areas. And I think that, also the connection that they've shown to emotional well-being contributes to that. And so what they've done is they've actually tracked people, both qualitative and quantitatively. They've actually gotten volunteers from the neighborhood who are willing to wear heart rate monitors that show that like their heart rates increase if they walk through a dumping lot, decrease if they walk past a green lot. And so that particular program that's called Land Care, which has done 12,000 lots, that is very well received by neighborhoods, generally, is my understanding. I don't know if there were any early problems with it, but generally, neighborhoods really appreciate and welcome that kind of intervention. Where we were seeing people worried about the interventions was when we came along and suggested more amenities and where we encouraged people to use the space. Because as it is kind of currently, you just walk past it. And so it definitely looks nicer and safer. But while the lots are technically open, very few people use them because it's like, is that mine? I don't know. Is that public? I'm not sure if I'm allowed in there. So people tend to just walk past or sit on the fence. And so the question was, can we give them some signs like a trail, like a path or a bench to say, you're welcome here? Would that make it even better? It seems like it would. And what we heard was, we don't want you to encourage people to stay here, especially if you live, a lot of it was people that lived right near those lots said, yes, clean it up, but don't encourage people to linger, and certainly don't encourage, benches, seating. They were worried that it would just draw more attention to their front porch. And I just remember one conversation that was really powerful of a mom who lived right next door and said, I would love for my kids to have a safe place to play, but I won't let my kids sit on the porch right now. I'm certainly not going to let them play, in that lot, even if you made it look good. And so that was where a lot of the initial ideas stepped way back and said, okay, maybe there's some interventions, especially along the edges, where people can work on the garden, plant things, build, paint, opportunities for like local artists to come and contribute murals and things, and to start to build a sense that this is a place for me. And then maybe in 5 years, we'll talk again about the idea of really encouraging more people to come in. Does that answer your question?
Thank you, Rebecca. This has been great to hear just what Olin's contributing to the design community, so thank you. I just wanted to ask, how does Olin justify the practice of Olin Labs, especially for those of us who are in like smaller firms in the community and want to implement research into like our everyday practice? Is it through impact? Is it through stewardship? But then also, kind of to add to that, how are you received by like the larger research community? Like, feel heard by the work that you're doing and putting out there?
That's an interesting question. So when you say justify, I think it depends on justify to whom. Do you mean to the board of Olin that is investing in this, or do you mean? Yeah. I think it took. Where's Ben Bonet? He can weigh in on this too. It wasn't easy. I think before I even got into this position at Olin, there were probably 15 years of like hand-wringing, about 10 to 15 years about what are we talking about with research. And we had an internal research group, but it was not an easy sell. And a lot of work was done among the owners, the board, to get to a point where people felt like, okay, this is worth doing. So that's just kind of like an internal conversation, I guess. And not that it's worth doing, but not only that it's worth doing, but it's really necessary. Like if we don't do this, like we're not going to be relevant. It's a necessity, was the sense. And then in terms of the relating to outside researchers, that's another really interesting one. And I think what my take is that I'm quite careful in that question of like, what is research, to not overstate our contribution to research as landscape architects, and to be very upfront about what we have to contribute. And so in each of these cases, so much of the research that I'm showing is happening, within these collaborations. Ask or answer intelligent questions about soil performance in the way that our collaborators at Temple do. And so it's a very open, like, reliance on their expertise. And then we come in and say, we're sort of managing the overall picture. And what's great is when we see people like our partners at Temple, who we've now been working with for 5 years, they'll come out, they'll be running the experiments. And then when we say, okay, we should also set up a manufacturing hub for this because we can't get it, we're getting it from upstate New York. And their response to that as researchers is just like, you can do that? What? We can make our own glass? And that's where they really see, okay, this is a different thing that practice can bring in terms of connecting. And like, let's sit down with the water department, let's sit down with Parks and Rec. It's those kinds of moves where they understand the value, which will help them bring their research more impactfully into application. And I think similarly with Dr. South, when she initially reached out, she was like, oh, I hear you guys are into vacant lots. Do you want to help me design these? So she had a fairly specific ask for us as designers. And over the course of our relationship with her, we would come to presentations with things that were a little bit further beyond what she was expecting, right? Not in terms of how great they were, but in terms of like, we're looking at this picture a little bit more broadly than you've asked. And we're looking at the system throughout the city, And so we find people by that kind of input or that kind of additional perspective. But one thing I think I'm really careful about is not claiming that we're going to like replace, the academic research center. It's a very different animal than what we're trying to do.
Rebecca, wonderful talk. I enjoyed it.
Thank you.
But I'm curious how you see this research and labs facility working within a smaller firm. I noticed Olin's 100 people.
Yep.
How would that work within a firm that's 10 or fewer people?
Yeah, I'm curious about that too. And actually, the way that I got hooked up here within situ is through David Cedar of Future Green, who's in Brooklyn. And I'm not sure exactly how big his shop is right now in Brooklyn, but it's a much smaller shop. And I've had lots of conversations with him about that question. How can they make research work? And I certainly don't have, an answer or any experience with that. But ultimately, I think what what David and I have talked about has to do with, I think each of the initiatives I've shown here are scaled in such a way that even in a larger firm, being very aware of like how much of the weight you're carrying and how much you're contributing. And so what that means is like if we took on this soils project and thought we were going to have to run the greenhouse studies ourselves and do the laboratory experiments ourselves, that would be like an investment that's way beyond what we can do. And so it's more like trying to imagine the ways that whatever percentage of time that you are able to implement, how can you direct that? One other thing I'll say is that I think there's a lot of collaboration in this research space. And I don't know if Emily, this has been your experience, but Design Workshop has a strong research kind of angle. And what I've found is that there's a lot of openness to collaboration across competitors in a way that it just doesn't exist in core practice. So we're competitors with all these firms in our day-to-day, but when it comes to this kind of research, we're all buddy-buddy, and like really like seriously open with like, how did you do this? I mean, like we're actually pretty regularly in communication with each other, trying to figure this out. And I would say that that's another piece that I would think smaller firms could benefit from, that openness of finding ways to tap into what a network of small firms or small, medium, large firms are doing, and figuring out how to kind of team up and like find synergies right across firms.
Cool. Can I miss any raised hands? Speak now. All right, cool.
Up here, ever?
Oh yeah, I can like talk loud. Get a mic. No, because I'm trying to, in my head, I was thinking about if you answered the question already about, like, I'm very interested in research and putting that into design and just research-based design in general. And I was just wondering, like, how would you advise a new practitioner on, like, bringing up to a firm to start doing these types of studies? Yeah. Essentially, I want to be the one to bring up to the leadership team, say, like, hey, we should start doing this type of research. Like, how would you advise me to get started with that? Do I just, like, knock on the door and...
I would be happy to like have a chat with you about that, because it's going to be so specific depending on who you're talking to. Like, I think that my job is so much easier than a lot of my kind of colleagues in this space, because the leadership buy-in was already in place when I kind of got past the baton. And in the 5 years I've been doing this, I've never had to question that. And that's been a real luxury. And I know people who have been doing really good work in this space, but where it's been a constant uphill battle, like a third of my managing group or whatever gets this, but then there are all these guys who are just like, what are we doing? And so if you have to fight that battle at the same time, it's much harder. And so I think, but I think you're right to think kind of very carefully about how to strategically enter into the conversation and make sure you have some backup about why and how you think that it's going to benefit your practice. And part of the benefit is keeping people like you happy, right? It's like part of that's absolutely part of the benefit of doing something like having something like this group, is that people that are coming out of school or in their early phases of career, like will be drawn to this kind of work, and that's in a competitive job market, that's a real value. And also kind of employee retention, quality of life stuff is a real value.